Hey podcast fam, Eric here, and if you're an affiliate marketer or looking to monetize your online presence, you need to know about shareasale.com. ShareASale is not just an affiliate network, it's your gateway to a world of opportunities. With thousands of high-paying affiliate programs across various niches, ShareASale connects you with top brands ready to collaborate with content creators like you. Imagine earning commissions for simply sharing products you love. Whether you're into fashion, tech, or lifestyle, ShareASale has got a partnership waiting for you. Ready to turn your passion into profits? Head over to krmpods.com/ShareASale and sign up today. It's free, it's easy, and it's your ticket to unlocking a new revenue stream.
You're listening to Fox City's Murder and Mayhem, your bi-weekly dose of true crime history in a small rural community of Wisconsin.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Fox City's Murder and Mayhem. I'm Eric.
I'm Gavin.
And Gavin, we're back again.
We are.
And we are traveling to...
We're at Kaukauna today.
Oh, that's right. I was going to make it a point because for the listeners, Gavin asked me yesterday, gave me a choice between two stories. So if you don't like this story, sorry, it's my fault. Because he gave me a choice.
No, it's okay.
And I was going to make a point to know that we were going back to Kaukauna because you told me it was a Kaukauna story.
Yeah.
And I screwed it up.
Yeah.
So
we're going to do this. I got 8 pages here.
8 pages.
We're not really going to do all 8 pages.
8 pages equals about a 7.5 hour podcast.
Yeah, we're not really going to do 8 pages here. Especially because it's really warm today and I just kind of want to get on with my day. All right. So this episode is crap. No, it's not. It's not.
Oh yes, and I have a feedback too from a podcast listener that we have to address
On Fox Cities?
on both podcasts. I think it was specifically for Milwaukee Mafia, but we're just going to talk about it here because I forgot to talk about it.
Oh, okay.
Because you just did what he said that we have to stop doing. He says, "You guys always talk about how bad the episode's going to be."
Yeah.
And then it never turns out to be bad.
Oh, okay.
So there's no more negativity here. Every episode is the best episode that we do.
All right. This episode's going to be the best episode
ever.
You are going to be thrilled, surprised. You're going to walk away more knowledgeable than you knew you could be.
That's what I like to hear.
Yes.
So we are in Kaukauna, and it's going to be the best episode ever.
It is. So this episode doesn't really belong on Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. Let's just throw it out there. Be honest, it doesn't. It's in the Fox Cities because it's in Kaukauna, but there's no murder and there's no mayhem.
And we do lots of episodes like that, and it's some of the best episodes.
Yeah.
So
the next episode is going to have a mass murder, so we'll make up for that. And an episode down the line in Kaukauna is going to be both in Kaukauna, the Fox Cities, and have
mass murder.
Well, not mass murder, but it's going to have multiple murder.
Okay.
So just deal with it. if you're like, this is no murder, man. Well, just deal with it. The reason this episode exists is because each month, as part of my day job, I do a history program, and I put together histories on these little topics. And most of the time, they have nothing to do with something I can put on this podcast. Mm-hmm. Like the next one I'm putting together is on the development of like the telephone industry in the Fox Cities. I think that's super interesting. But guess what? That's not remotely Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem. Like I can't even find a way to make that work. So, you have to go to my program if you want to hear it, because guess what? It's not going on this podcast. But when I can use something there and on the podcast, I may as well, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Why recreate? I mean, you did the work.
I already did the work here. So,
yeah.
So what this is the Holy Cross Fire.
Okay.
And I think this story is super fascinating. I'm not going to get down into like the details of it like I will for the program, because you don't need to know all the details. Like, unless you are a member of the Holy Cross Church, it's not going to matter to you. Mm-hmm. But there is some stuff I would think is interesting and is relevant to a broader audience.
Now, just so for my memory, is Holy Cross the one that is behind by the post office?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure I'm at the right church. And for clarification, because I'm assuming this happened a while ago, that's where it was located when this fire happened.
Yes.
Okay.
So Holy Cross Parish in Kaukauna is essentially the original Catholic church in Kaukauna.
Okay.
There's, you hedge it a little bit because the Catholics in Kaukauna go all the way back to the 1700s. Way back.
Okay.
But originally they didn't have a church. A traveling priest had to come through every so often. Then they had a chapel in like the 1830s, but it was kind of like a temporary thing. They'd usually have services at somebody's house. Then later, they would actually have to go to, if they wanted to go to a physical, real church, they'd have to go to Little Chute. And finally, in 1873, Kaukauna had its own church on the north side, which was Holy Cross.
Okay.
So that's the church we're talking about. If you're North Side Catholic, this is the church you go to. Everybody has a great time. It's a gathering place for the community, not just as a church, but also, a lot of activities get done there because the church is sort of the center of town.
Mm-hmm.
And for people not super familiar with Kaukauna, and these are not real numbers, these are just my estimates, I would say Kaukauna is like 50% Catholic, 40% Lutheran, and like 10% other things. If you're one of those 10% other things and you want to like fight me on that, I'm not going to fight you. I don't have the exact numbers. That's just my experience, is that almost everybody is Catholic, but if you weren't, you were probably Lutheran. And I know that's not true. I know there's a Baptist church, and there's like a Hindu temple. So I know there's other things, but it's a predominantly Catholic city.
Right.
October 29th, 1913. An alarm went out at 7:30 p.m. after Officer James McFadden was making his rounds and saw a light in the church basement. McFadden stopped at the rectory to get a key so the light could be extinguished. For those of you who aren't Catholic, the rectory is the little house that the priest lives in.
I also, and you probably are not going to remember this, but I feel like we did a story with James McFadden before.
It's certainly possible.
Yeah, I really feel like he was the cop on some murder case or something.
He probably was. I think he was the cop on the Hilda Lingle murder case.
Was that the one where they shot?
It's the one where a guy shot his wife and then like kind of staged it to make it look like his daughter did it.
Yep. That's the one I'm thinking of too, I think.
Okay.
So
they got the key. They went back to turn off the light in the basement. But when they got there, they realized it actually wasn't a light on. It was a fire. A pile of material near the basement furnace was burning. The newspaper just says material. I don't know what was burning, but material near the furnace was burning.
Hopefully not a pile of Bibles.
I doubt that. I hope not. It was soon being battled by the priest with pans and pails of water from the faucet. Things seemed to be under control, but the priest, Father Van Bogart, went upstairs and found the church full of smoke to the point that he could not breathe, and ran around the other side to find the sacristy also full of smoke. For people who aren't Catholic, the sacristy is like this little room where the priest and the altar boys like get dressed before service time.
Okay.
All right. For those who don't know, I was raised Catholic, so I know what some of these terms are.
I too was raised Catholic. I didn't know what those terms were.
Were you an altar boy?
Yeah, I was an altar boy.
Well, what the heck, man? While waiting for the fire department, the nuns gathered up whatever things they could and carried them from the building. Van Bogart went to the altar, grabbing the sacred host. He was not able to do much else, as a sanctuary lamp fell from the ceiling when its wire cable snapped, launching a sheet of flame as it crashed. The newspaper wrote, "The fiery tongues darted neatly down to the floor."
Well put. Put.
Plaster fell down. Van Bogart made it out with the host and the chalices, and not much else. A bunch of people arrived onto the scene, both the fire department and just people in the community. Within minutes, the flames had spread over the entire roof, over the altar, and along the transept. Again, this is a quote from the paper, the devouring flames licked up the shingles as if they were chaff and scattered them to the winds.
Man, don't you wish they wrote stuff like they did back then?
Yeah.
Still today.
It's something. Hundreds of people were said to rush there with, quote, half the population of Kaukauna ringed around the fire. I'm sure that's an exaggeration. The wind was southward, which was something of a blessing because the ashes and sparks blew away from the school and the rectory, saving them. A light rain earlier in the day probably also helped because sparks landed on businesses along the river, but only one of them burned a little bit, but they caught it quickly and could put it out. Another quote from the paper. The myriads of flying sparks resembled the belching forth of a volcano.
Wow.
When I could use these actual quotes, I'll mix them in.
I mean, I'm wondering if we should just create a podcast of you just reading weird newspaper clips from over the years.
I don't know. I don't know. The sky was red and could be seen for 30 miles in every direction. By 8:30, an hour after the alarm went off, the tower was engulfed and the large cross tumbled to the ground. Some brick walls stood standing at this point, as well as what the paper called the monster chimney. The other priest at Holy Cross, Father Lockman, was 12 miles away in Greenville at the time, because he was there doing some other priest things. He received a telephone call, and Father Lockman ran outside, looked into the sky, and could see the sky glowing red, and he's like, yep, church is on fire. So he ran to the train depot, caught the next train, and arrived back in Kaukauna at 9:28 p.m., which by that point was much too late. Right. The church was pretty much completely destroyed. There are photos of it after the fact, which you can't see because this is a podcast. But I describe it as looking like the bombing of Dresden.
Wow.
Which I don't know like if that reference works for people, but like some of the walls are still standing, but it's like to the point you couldn't even do anything with them. You'd have to take them down to rebuild anyway. Mm-hmm. It's completely destroyed. Gutted. Just a mess. Within a week of the fire, over $3,000 had been raised to rebuild the church. Leading the way on this was church trustee John George Fechter, who handled the collection. I'm not going to name most of the names, like I said, in this thing I wrote. Like I'll mention more of them when I do the live version, which by the time people hear this on the podcast, I'll already have done. Mm-hmm. But like I said, you're not really going to be all that concerned. But I will talk about John G. Fechter a little bit because he's going to be important to this story. He ran a store in town and seems to have been well off. I don't know if he was like a millionaire or anything like that, but he was doing well enough that he was often like the guy they would turn to if they needed to raise money for things or he would invest in stuff. Not known today at all. Like if you say the Fechter name in Kaukauna, nobody knew who you were talking about. Mm-hmm. But in the day, like he was a pretty important guy. After the fire happened, services had to be held in a building on Wisconsin Avenue. They just kind of rented out space for a while. They encouraged people to go to the other church in town, which is St. Mary's. But specifically, they wanted it. They said, if you're young and healthy, go to St. Mary's. If you're old and decrepit, go to this building on Holy Cross. And the reason being is this is 1913. Pretty much nobody has a car.
So getting to the other church is probably quite a feat.
Yeah.
Is that
so like getting to the other side of town, having to cross the river and get around, like unless you're young, it's not going to be great. Mm-hmm. You know, it's going to be a long walk, or you're going to have to get your horse all ready to go, that sort of thing. So they kind of try to divide it up by ages because St. Mary's could only take on so many more people as well. They were able to get the original altar from Little Chute set up in their temporary Holy Cross church area, which I think this is pretty cool because it was in 1848. This is an altar is an altar. It's just a table, but it's pretty cool because it was the altar used by Father Vandenbroek, and Father Vandenbroek is like a major figure in the development of the Fox Cities.
Okay,
because he's the guy who gets like 3 boatloads of Dutch people and said, no, that's what it was. 3 boatloads of Dutch people. And he says, hey, I need Dutch people to come to Little Chute. So he loads up Dutch people and he brings them to Little Chute.
Okay.
And today, like almost all the Dutch people in Little Chute are descendants of these 3 boatloads of Dutch people.
That's incredible.
That Father Vandenbroek brought there. So like when they came and they set up their church, like this is his original altar. So I think that's cool they still had that around. You know, again, I'm not like terribly religious, but like even from a historical point of view, like that's a cool artifact to have. Mm-hmm. They continue raising money. It goes pretty well. They get various plans together of what they can do to rebuild. They get some money together. They get some plans together. They end up going to an architect in Milwaukee named Erhard Brielmeier, and he was a pretty big deal. He had made plans for churches in nearly every state in the Union and every province in Canada.
Wow. Yeah.
So unless you're like super into architecture, you've never heard the name Erhard Brielmeier.
But if you're super into architecture, he's probably a pretty big deal.
He was a pretty big deal. This guy was primarily known for building churches. So like if you find churches that were built around this time, you know, like 1900 to 1920, there's a fairly good chance that he was somehow involved.
Interesting.
He was like the guy. Bricks are moved in even before the building is like approved because they feel like if they get the bricks right away, they'll save money later. I don't know logistics of that, but they did it. Again, plans are laid out. They send the original bell back to Cincinnati. The bell during the fire had fallen to the ground, cracked, smashed, wasn't any good. But they sent it back to Cincinnati, to the foundry there, and they had a new bell cast out of the old bell.
Okay. So
that's kind of neat. So as far as I know, the bell that's in Holy Cross today
is that recast
bell, which in itself is the original bell, sort of.
I mean, it's a recast of the original bell, so
yeah.
But
so depending on how you feel, but like whether that's the same bell or not, but that's kind of neat that they are able to take the bell and make the bell out of the bell.
Yeah.
So if nothing else, that bell's debatably original.
Mm-hmm.
Bidding went out for the project. The most they could spend on it was $40,000, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's pretty good money in those days.
Mm-hmm.
Winning the bid was John Coppice. And John Coppice is an interesting guy because at the same time, he also happens to be the mayor of Kaukauna, but he is primarily known as a contractor.
Okay.
So like this isn't like a corruption thing. Like he really would have been a good guy for the job. And if you knew churches that were being built around this time, not only is this guy in Milwaukee, there's a good chance he's the architect, there's a good chance that John Coppice was the guy who actually did the physical building.
Mm-hmm.
Because on top of rebuilding Holy Cross, he's the guy who built St. Mary's in Kaukauna, St. Francis in Hollandtown. He built a church in Kiel. So this guy's getting around building churches in the area.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of neat to know that the mayor of Kaukauna was also like the guy who built the churches in the Fox Cities area. The cornerstone is laid in June 1914, so the following summer from the fire. People from all over are coming. You know, all the different priests, all the people from Catholic organizations. The local bishop was there. Giving the main speech was a man named Reverend Rickard from Ricklin from Green Bay. And this guy is an interesting guy, this Father Ricklin.
Okay.
So he had originally been growing up on the border between France and Germany. At a time where Germany was kind of like taking over surrounding areas. This is a whole other thing, but like Germany as we know it today exists from 1870. This is the time when all the different German areas, Prussia, Bavaria, so on, all kind of came together and became Germany.
Okay.
And in the process, there was this big, huge political fight between the government of Germany and the Catholic Church. And the government of Germany was run by Otto von Bismarck, you might have heard of Bismarck, pretty big name. He was Prussian, he was Lutheran, and he liked the idea of Germany being Lutheran. But when he started combining these new areas into what would become Germany, some of the new areas he combined were heavily Catholic.
Okay.
At that point in time, the Catholic Church was very serious about how things would be run in areas that were predominantly Catholic. Being the Pope meant something.
Mm-hmm.
So Bismarck did not like the idea that the Pope, I mean, he wasn't personally doing it, but like he was overseeing all these schools and all these areas and things like that. And Father Ricklin, who's growing up in this area, he runs a newspaper that's a Catholic newspaper in an area that's now about to become Germany.
Okay.
And Bismarck doesn't like the fact that he has this newspaper that's writing these very pro-Catholic articles because he sees Catholicism as a very bad thing for a modern country to embrace.
Okay.
This is, like I said, this is a huge topic, way outside the scope of this podcast. But it's such an issue that not only does this newspaper get shut down, but Ricklin ends up going to jail over running this newspaper.
Wow.
So, interesting guy. Like, he later moves to America where being Catholic is more accepted. But he's got this whole background of where he actually spent jail time just for being Catholic. So, cool guy to kind of like have in the Green Bay area and giving like this speech at the cornerstone of Holy Cross. Time capsule goes into the cornerstone. As far as I know, it's still in there. I don't think they ever took it back out. Several hundred people were said to have attended the cornerstone laying, which is a pretty significant number of people. Priests from all over arrived. One priest arrived from as far away as Kansas to attend this event, so pretty big deal there. Building continues on, building the walls, building the interior, building the roof. For the first year, services are actually held in the basement because the basement was constructed first, which obviously, but, you know, they were able to set up a little chapel down there and get the heat and stuff running. So for the very first year of Holy Cross, the new one, they're holding it in the basement. During the course of things going on here, the Pope passes away. Now, the Pope doesn't really have anything to do with your day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't care how good of a Catholic you are. You're not like actively listening to the Pope. But it was kind of a big deal in that this Pope, Pope Pius X, was one of the last popes who was really strongly like conservative, old world Catholic. Again, like today it's really hard to comprehend how strong things were top down. Mm-hmm. You and I are of an age where like we went to church and church was in English.
Yeah.
But even our parents, when they were kids, you couldn't even have church in English.
Really?
It was in Latin.
Well, that just seems useless.
Yeah. But it's a relatively modern thing where churches were allowed to give services in a native language.
I'm pretty sure that I know the answer to this, but like back then, nobody spoke. Like Latin is pretty much dead, right? And
unless you were a priest, yes.
but like back then, still Latin was pretty much dead unless you were
a priest.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, most people who went to church had no idea what they were saying. Had no clue.
That is so weird.
Yeah, it's really, really weird. The paper wrote about it, this passing. Naturally, Catholics throughout this country would like to see an American cardinal become pope. They singled out somebody who they'd specifically like. Well, guess what? No American has ever become pope. And may never become pope. That's just not a thing that happens. But, yeah, so that was it was interesting that it happened during this time where they're rebuilding the church because it's more in the conversation then. The local priest gives a big long speech on how the Pope had changed the church within like the 10 years that he was Pope. I'm not going to read that here. The big thing that he did that actually did affect people was he changed the age that you could get First Communion.
Okay.
Traditionally, they didn't give it to children. He lowered the age down to 7, and he said, well, if you know anything about Jesus, Jesus loved kids. So why aren't we letting kids embrace Jesus?
So what was the age before then, like 18?
I don't know what the actual age was, but it was definitely at least teenage years.
Yeah, wasn't anybody young.
And here they decided that 7 was the age where children could make rational decisions about whether or not they wanted to accept it, which I will say that is not probably correct.
That's true.
But that was the thinking behind it, that like you could ask a 7-year-old, hey, do you really love Jesus? And the kids would be like, yeah. And they're like, okay, come on and get your wafer and your wine. I would say, maybe kids those days were different than kids today, but kids I know today,
they're not ready. They're
not ready to make that decision.
Yet.
Their parents are going to tell them they're ready, but they themselves are probably not ready. Yeah. Building continues on. The bell comes back. Donations are continuing to come in. What really strikes me as interesting is how this was a community effort. You would think the building of a Catholic church would be something that the Catholics care about.
Mm-hmm.
But the community really came together on this one. The community raised money, and they really wanted there to be a great clock tower with a great clock on 4 sides of the clock tower, lit up so you could see it anywhere on the north side of town. You could see it any hour of the day. This was seen as really like a centerpiece of the north side of town. And whether you were Catholic or not, that was, to you, the city's clock tower.
Mm-hmm.
So they got everybody to kind of kick in money for that. All the stores had little collection boxes, whether the store owner was Catholic or not. And I thought that was really neat, just the way that this story was not a Catholic story so much as a community story.
Right.
So that jumped out at me. When the bell came back, it was blessed by Bishop Fox and put in, and the first bell rang out in November 1914. So now a little over a year after the fire, right after the bell rings for the first time, the new cross, big copper cross, goes up on the steeple. As far as I know, same one's still there today. 2 more bells were donated to go along with the big bell. One of the bells was donated by Robert Fechter, who was the son of John Fechter, who was like the primary guy gathering money for the rebuilding here. Another big money gatherer is John Fechter's daughter, who, this is another way where I feel like this family had to be doing pretty well, because his daughter runs an art studio and piano teaching building. Mm-hmm. She rents out space where she teaches piano and does art lessons. And she was a university graduate, mm-hmm. which this is like the 1910s.
Yeah.
if you're like a single lady and you've had a college education and you're running a business where you're teaching people art and piano, I feel like your family's doing all right. Because this is not like a money-making business.
Right.
On top of the fact that most women aren't going to college. Mm-hmm. So I get that impression. The new bells go in, and somebody writes the newspaper. One of the writers of the newspaper, they don't sign things back then. Newspaper articles didn't say by so-and-so. Mm-hmm. Somebody wrote that the pleasing chimes brought back memories of over half a century to the beautiful Sabbath morning in the city of Boston, when with a brother we had become lost in the maze of streets which converged at the center of that ancient town. We had arisen early and resolved on a trip of exploration before breakfast into the shipping and other forbidden districts, and had become confused and lost when the peals of the chime of bells attracted us to go nearer to them, when it at once occurred to us that they were the bells near where we were visiting at the home of relatives. And then we easily found our way back home at about 10 o'clock in the morning, to our parents, who were about to have our absence investigated by the police department. The whole neighborhood had been aroused, and were searching for the two lost boys, aged 8 and 10, when they suddenly came back, guided home by the chiming bells, which were playing in pealing tones the beautiful old song of Lisher, which was then set to the words, "Welcome, delightful morn, thou day of sacred rest." It was calling worshippers to service as we two lost lads came rushing back to the home we were glad to find after 5 hours' absence.
It's another powerful statement right there. That's taken directly from the paper, too?
Taken directly from the paper. But the thing is, so these bells go off, right? And the newspaper writer feels the need to write this, and it gets published, so the editor feels this should go in there, too, of him talking about a story from 50 years ago of him being a little boy wandering the streets of Boston. What does that have to do with anything? Nothing.
The bells in Kaukauna remind him of those bells.
But this is how he chooses to be like, man, I really like these new church bells. When the writers of the newspaper in that day, like when they were given free reign to write whatever they want, they wrote some goofy stuff. This is a nice thing. I'm sure people appreciated it. And especially if you knew who the writer was. I have no clue who the writer was. Mm-hmm. But at that time, people in town probably knew who the writers were. So they'd be like, oh, that's a good story of when you were a kid.
Yeah, and I think if you remembering back to the Kaukauna Times days,
yeah,
this is the kind of article that the Kaukauna Times would write.
Yeah,
it's just an uplifting, very happy-go-lucky type.
But it's just kind of funny because
it really has
nothing in this is news. Yeah. This is not a news story. April 1915, Father Ricklin of Green Bay, who had delivered the sermon at the Cornerstone, passed away. So he's no longer there. The clock tower was active by October 1915. And the paper says that this is an important part of any well-regulated municipality. As long as its hands move from figure to figure and the bell tolls the hours, the town clock will be part of the history of Kaukauna. Births and deaths, weddings and farewells will be associated with the striking of the clock. The article spoke in reverence about the new clock, but also mixed in some humor. They joked, hereafter, irate patters, this is a very fancy way of saying angry priests, irate patters, lying awake in bed will hear the town clock toll 10, 11, 12, maybe 1. And then they will go to the top of the stairs and ask Mabel how much longer that young man is going to stay in the clock tower. I don't know who Mabel is. I don't know if Mabel's a real person. But I like this. They're like, you always know what time it is, but when it gets to be 1 in the morning and you hear the clock, you're going to get mad that guy's still ringing the bells. What the heck? Church interior is still being built. And then finally in May of 1916, the church is fully completed with the pipe organ and everything inside. So it takes them slightly over 2 years to rebuild this place.
Yeah, that's not shocking to me. There's a lot that goes into a church,
Yeah. Now, the reason I bring up the Fector family, not only because the father, the son, and the daughter are all actively contributing and raising money, it's kind of an unfortunate after thing where Robert Fector, the son, passes away in July 1916. So right after the church is completed. And he's still a young man. Mm-hmm. John Fector continues to be a major sponsor for the church. He erects a monument in Holy Cross Cemetery in October of 1916. He installs some beautiful windows there in the church in February 1917. And then his health goes downhill. He has to close his store, and he passes away in 1921. So within 5 years of the church going up. Before he passes away, his daughter, who operated the art studio, she passes away in August 1918. She's only 27 years old. And with three of them going, by 1921, the Fector name is pretty much erased from Kaukauna entirely.
Wow.
And that was like really, really weird to me. Like, there's such a major part of getting this church built, raising the money, getting the bells, getting the windows, getting, it's a huge part of this. And within 5 years of the church being completed, the father, his son, and his daughter are all dead.
Mm-hmm.
And the son and the daughter are young. I mean, in their 20s.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So...
And nothing major happened? They just
got sick.
Just got sick and died?
Just got sick.
Huh.
So I'm like, ooh. Like...
That's a bad omen, right?
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I don't know that it's a bad omen, but it's I thought it was interesting that within this short time between the fire and the rebuilding, the Pope passes, a priest passes, and 3 members of the family who rebuilt it all pass. Like, that's not like eerie or anything, but a lot of big changes happening in this short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So, but after that, the church does well, and it's now on the National Register of Historic Places. So,
and for the most part, that is still the church that was rebuilt.
Yeah,
that's there today.
Yes.
Wow.
So yeah, is this a murder and mayhem story? Absolutely not. But I put it together for my monthly history program, and I thought it wouldn't be completely out of place here because it's almost more of a positive story, which we don't generally do, of how this tragedy, this fire, actually, the good that comes out of it. The community comes together in the rebuilding.
Together to win.
Yeah.
So,
definitely not your usual Fox Cities Murder and Mayhem story, but I thought I'm really proud of this story. I really enjoyed researching it. I really enjoyed writing it. And I wanted to share it with a wider audience, and
and
my podcast, I can do that.
Yeah,
so.
And I think it belongs on this podcast because you say not murder or mayhem, but I would say a fire burning down a building is mayhem in certain ways. So even if it's not caused by any malicious intent,
I mean, and we're not going to cover like all the fires because there's fires all the time, but a church fire I think is significant,
and the first Catholic church in Kaukauna burning down, that's very significant.
Yeah.
So
I mean that's a big deal. I cannot imagine the emotion in town at the time. Again, I'm gonna keep saying this. Like, I'm not the most religious person, but I know a lot of people who are, and I think even more so 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
If your church that you've devoted your life to is burnt down, that's got to really hit you.
I would think so, and especially think about it nowadays. Yes, and just think about how much more amplified it was back when this church burned down. Because, like you said, everybody was Catholic, and when you say everybody was Catholic, I take that as everybody was practicing Catholicism,
right?
Which is, there's a lot of Catholic people today that, I mean, I would assume that we're both still considered Catholic in some way.
Right.
But we certainly don't practice.
No. Like, you got to get like how big of a deal this is. Like, not just that people are practicing Catholic, but some of this still exists today, but not like it did then, because there's the Catholic Order of Foresters. There's the Holy Name Society. There's the Knights of Columbus. There's all these Catholic groups. Every single church didn't just have like one group. They had like 3, 4, 5 subgroups that you could be a member of and be involved with both the church and the community. And that is not as big of a thing now, which is not just a religious thing. I mean, in general, those kind of societies are going away. That's the sad truth of the matter. You know, like in Kaukauna now today, we still have the Lions Club, but that's one of the few clubs that's still really active.
Mm-hmm.
But back then, if you remember of a church, your church could have a half a dozen clubs that you could be a part of just within that church.
Right.
So people were very involved.
We're very involved, and it looks like you said in this experience, in this example too, it extended just past, because I mean, these people also viewed this as like kind of the town square, the center. Like they wanted the clock there so that it, you know, showed over the entire city and blah blah blah. And so even if you weren't Catholic, this was still a big deal to you because that was kind of like the symbol of your town.
Yeah.
Even though you didn't really recognize it, the religion, that building still was a big deal to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So yeah, I think it was a good story, and I think the kids that are going to get to hear it, I assume this is for like a kid's history
No,
thing.
not for the kids.
Oh,
I mean, kids can go, but it's for the adults.
For everybody?
It's for everybody.
Okay. Well, I guess it's not going to come out until after you've done it, so it doesn't matter for announcing when the actual live presentation would be. But how often do you do these at the library? If there is
once a month.
Once a month, is it on a set day usually? That
I think it's like the third Tuesday of the month. I think that's how it's decided.
Can you give anybody like a little synopsis of what future ones coming up, or do you really have no idea what the net?
Oh, no, I totally know. Like I had mentioned in the beginning, like the next one coming up will be like the development of the telephone in the Fox cities, which like if I just say that to you, the development of the telephone, you're like, well, that's stupid. Like, no, it's not.
That actually sounds pretty interesting to me.
It's not. It's not stupid because like back in the day, you didn't have AT&T and you didn't have whoever else. You started these little tiny businesses from scratch.
And then they connected.
And it wasn't like, oh, I have a phone in my house, now I can call New York. No, that isn't how that worked.
You could call maybe to Appleton.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe if they connected the wires.
Yeah, but like when you were the first person in town to get a phone, you couldn't call anybody. You had to wait for the second guy in town to get a phone. So like there really is a lot of work that goes into developing the phones.
And just I can't imagine the mess that went into that. So
so that's a thing that'll be coming up. I don't remember what else is coming after that, but there's a bunch of things that'll be coming. I mean, I do it every month. One of the big things I want to talk about, probably later this year, is the Greyhound Park in Kaukauna. And when I say Greyhound Park, for people who don't know, I don't mean like a place you go to walk your greyhound. There used to be like the dog track where you would bet on greyhound racing. And Eric and I are of an age where, I mean, when I was a kid, I went there. But by the time we were like adults, it was gone already.
Yeah.
But that's something I've been looking into a lot. And that is a really interesting story. Like, more than just like, oh, it's a place people went and they gambled on dogs. Like, what went into getting that to exist, because at this point in time, like gambling was not legal. So to get it to actually pass, and how much it got mixed into both local and state politics, and then how this caused problems with the local Indian nations who were like, hey, what are you doing?
Yeah, you can't do that. You're tapping into our casino business.
Yeah. And this whole thing, and how so many promises were made about how this was going to make like the community super wealthy. And some people were totally on board with that. And other people, like from day one, were like, no, this is an incredibly bad idea. And, you know, I don't know how I would have felt about it at the time. I can't say that. But I can say from what I know happened after the fact.
It seemed like it was a really bad idea.
The people who were like this is not a great idea, may have been onto something, because it ended up that property really was just an absolute blight on the community for like 20 years after the fact.
Yeah, like you're saying, once they closed it, because
once they closed
it, they couldn't do anything with it for whatever reason.
Yeah, and this is such a huge thing that I want to do it in two parts. I want to do the building to success and then the aftermath. I want to do it in two parts because like the aftermath is the part that I think a lot of people remember today, where they tried to get a Walmart and that fell through. They tried to get a water park and that fell through.
Yeah, and I remember all these.
Yeah, and it like a lot of they tried to get the Stockbridge to take over the property. All these different things that didn't work out, where eventually they just tore it down and turned it into a. Now it's finally growing into something.
Yeah,
but it took forever.
Right.
A lot of people remember that part, but I don't think a lot of people remember the early part.
I remember
where all the politicians and the business people are like, this is going to be huge. We're going to have to build hotels everywhere. We're going to have to do this. And certain, again, some people were opposed. They thought it was a bad idea. Some people were just against it on principle because they didn't want legalized gambling in town.
Yeah.
But just how many politicians and businessmen were like, millions of dollars are going to be streaming into the community. And how much the city adjusted its business model when they were like, okay, all this tax revenue is going to come in, and that was offsetting like school money. They changed the way that they were like collecting the money, where they started to anticipate it. And when the dog track started losing money and eventually going under, it kicked the schools in the butt.
Oh, wow.
Because the city was anticipating all this money to come in, basically indefinitely. So they were
spending money that should have been used for the schools in anticipation that money was going to come from this.
I'm not sure on the details, but it got to the point where it went from, we're going to get this extra, $500,000 in taxes each year, to like, maybe we're not.
Wow.
So when you start to depend on something and it goes away, like, it's why you should not put all your love and support into one thing, and then like, if it fails, your business model is screwed, which I know personally very well.
Oh yeah.
but like from a city government perspective, like, oof, they really depended on this more than they probably should have.
I would love to see that as a podcast. So just floating that out. I know it doesn't fit on this podcast whatsoever, but I mean, I'm not against telling that story because I think that's a really fascinating story.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that, I mean, I'm sure a lot of our listeners are from Kaukauna and remember this.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like the Peshtigo fire, because we all know it, but do we know anything about it?
Well, really? Yeah, and I've been learning a lot. This is this isn't even going to be something that I present for months from now. So I'm only just on the beginning end of that. But yeah, there was so much more going, because again, like when it was active, like I only went there once or twice when it was active, and I was a kid. Mm-hmm. I was maybe 10. Mm-hmm. And so, I didn't know. But now that I've been like reading like the actual like reports as things are in progress and there's negotiations, like, oh man, there was a lot going on. And it's interesting.
Sounds a lot like, if anybody's listening is familiar with the Foxconn thing in Mount Pleasant.
Yeah.
Or is it Mount Pleasant? I think it's Mount Pleasant.
Is it Mount Pleasant or is it Pleasant Prairie? I think it is Mount Pleasant.
I think Mount Pleasant's just north of Pleasant Prairie. So.
Yeah, I think it is Mount Pleasant.
But either way, like that just mess. That, I mean, that's probably even
it's
bigger.
It's not remotely on that level, but it's the same concept. Yeah, it's the same concept where you get it. Yeah, same things like, you put like a TIF district, and I'm not going to get into that. What a TIF district is and all that, but you change the way you do taxes and stuff and everything to incentivize things, and then boom, if it doesn't work, it's not great.
Up. So, all right, well. we're way over on this podcast, so
I know. But anyways, this episode was a good episode for people to kind of know what I do other than this podcast or the Mafia stuff. Like, this is the stuff that I do on a day-to-day basis, is I look into these stories and I develop like histories of people and businesses and whatnot from the area. So most of it has nothing to do with murder and mayhem. But
at the same time, it's still, most of the listeners are from this area. And this is a story that they should know. You know, the fact that these things happen around us and we never really have any sort of idea. That's what this podcast is all about, is opening your eyes to the things that are happening in your community or have happened to your community, I guess would be the more accurate answer. So
absolutely. And I'm usually surprised by what I find. Like, most of the time, a story that I think is going to be just, not boring, but just average, normal story. There's usually at least one piece of it that's going to jump out and be like, oh, wow, that happened here? So.
Yeah. So. All right, with that, we will wrap this episode up. We want to thank everybody again for their continued support of this podcast. And we will be back in 2 weeks with another episode. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you. Come back for the mass murder.
Thanks for tuning in to Fox City's Murder and Mayhem. Join us in 2 weeks for another exciting episode of Murder and Mayhem.